Two police officers had no clue that when they made an arrest that day, they would later stand before that same person as their judge. It was a bright afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park buzzed with activity. Children's laughter filled the air. Runners moved along the pathways, and families enjoyed picnics beneath towering oak trees. In this lively yet serene setting, an African-American woman sat quietly on a bench by the pond, an oversized hardcover book open in her hands. Her name was Camille, a highly regarded lawyer stealing a precious moment away from her hectic career. She was deeply absorbed in her reading when the harsh squeal of brakes shattered her focus. A patrol car came to a stop at the curb, drawing curious looks from several bystanders. Two uniformed officers emerged, their faces hard and projecting an air of command. Their attention immediately fixed on Camille, the sole person sitting by herself in that area. "Ma'am, can we have a word with you?" one officer called out, his voice carrying suspicion rather than genuine concern. Camille looked up from her pages, her composure remaining steady. "Certainly," she answered, gently closing her book. The second officer moved closer, his manner curt. "We received a report about some suspicious behavior around here. Care to explain what brings you to this spot?" Camille's eyebrow lifted, clearly confused. "Suspicious behavior? I'm simply sitting here with my book." She lifted the volume as evidence of her innocent activity, yet their intense scrutiny continued. "Let's see some identification," the first officer commanded. Her heart rate increased, though she stayed calm. "I'm confused. What's the basis for this request?" "Standard procedure," the second officer stated, though his inflection suggested otherwise. The small gathering of onlookers began to whisper among themselves. Some appeared merely curious, while others shared uneasy looks, recognizing the unfairness of what they were witnessing. Camille let out a soft sigh and reached for her purse, retrieving her wallet. When she presented her driver's license, one officer seized it, examining the details with excessive thoroughness. "Camille Johnson," he announced with what seemed like contempt. "What brings you to this location, Miss Johnson?" Camille took a slow breath, working to maintain her composure. "I'm a resident of this community. I came to enjoy some time in the park." "Is there something wrong with that?" The officer's expression hardened. "We'll determine that." He returned her identification. Rather than departing, they remained nearby, continuing their questioning in a way that felt more like harassment than routine inquiry. "Do you typically walk around with books like that?" One officer said with disdain. "Are you here alone or meeting someone?" The other pressed, his hand deliberately positioned near his duty belt. Camille had navigated numerous high-pressure courtroom situations, but this felt entirely different. The imbalance of power was obvious, and their attitude carried a hostility she knew all too well. Nevertheless, she selected her words with care. "I won't be answering additional questions until you explain what I'm supposedly guilty of," she stated with conviction. Her resistance appeared to provoke them. The first officer moved forward. "Don't get clever with us," he barked. "We're simply performing our duties." "And I understand my rights," Camille responded, her tone unwavering. "I'm not violating any laws by enjoying a public park." But logic wasn't part of their plan. The first officer grabbed for her arm. "You're being uncooperative," he declared, despite Camille remaining perfectly still. "What's happening?" she cried out, caught off guard. The murmuring from the crowd intensified. A bystander pulled out his cell phone to capture the incident. "Stop fighting us," the officer repeated more loudly, as though putting on a show for the expanding audience. Camille's pulse raced as she felt the harsh steel of handcuffs lock around her wrists. She struggled to remain composed, even as shame and anger blazed within her. The officers escorted her toward their vehicle, dismissing concerns voiced by witnesses. Camille turned toward the crowd, making eye contact with a young woman recording on her phone. In that instant, There was a wordless understanding, a quiet request to preserve evidence of this wrong being committed. As the car door closed with a bang, Camille understood this wasn't the conclusion of her story. It was merely the opening chapter. Confined in the tight rear seat of the squad car, Camille's thoughts churned rapidly. She had dedicated years to representing clients, championing justice, and working within the legal framework. Now she found herself on the opposite side of that system. The ridiculousness of her situation hit her, but there was nothing amusing about it, only fury. The journey to the precinct was oppressively quiet, interrupted only by static from the police communications. Camille gazed through the glass, her reflection blending with the moving landscape outside. Her wrists throbbed from the restraints cutting into her flesh. At the station, conditions deteriorated further. The processing procedure was intrusive, degrading, and crafted to rob her of her self-respect. She was printed, photographed, and placed in a cramped holding area where fluorescent bulbs hummed constantly overhead. "Hope you like your accommodations," one of the officers remarked smugly as he locked the cell. Camille settled onto the frigid bench, her fingers intertwined tightly in her lap. She mentally reviewed the park incident repeatedly. How had such a tranquil afternoon descended into this nightmare? The explanation was both obvious and painful. Bias. Time crawled by before anyone paid her any attention again. A junior officer came to the cell with a clipboard in hand. "Ms. Johnson, you're being charged with resisting arrest and interfering with police work," he announced flatly. "Based on what evidence?" Camille demanded, her voice harder than she meant to be. "You can address that with a judge," he answered before walking away. She breathed out slowly, forcing herself to think tactically. The accusations were weak, and she was aware of it. However, she also understood the battle ahead would be challenging. Cases similar to hers seldom were straightforward. Eventually, Camille was freed on bond. As she exited the station, the cool evening breeze struck her like a force, a sharp contrast to the suffocating environment inside. She noticed her colleague and friend, Marissa, waiting at the curb. "Camille!" Marissa hurried over, her expression showing both relief and worry. "Are you all right?" Camille gave a nod, though her body betrayed her with a subtle shake. "I'm okay," she said, though the statement felt empty. During their drive, Marissa kept looking her way, waiting for her to open up. At last, Camille spoke up. "I'm not going to let this go, Marissa. Not this time." Marissa's hands gripped the wheel more tightly. "What's your plan?" "My plan is that I'm sick of this happening," Camille answered. "I have the skills, the expertise, and the means to push back. And I intend to." That night, Camille sat at her dining table, surrounded by legal notebooks and open reference books. She labored without rest, drafting a civil rights case against the officers and their department. Her hands trembled not from anxiety, but from a burning resolve. As days became weeks, the community started to unite behind her. The recording of her arrest, posted by the young woman from the park, had spread across social media. Individuals from every background contacted her with supportive messages, sharing their own experiences with injustice. Camille's determination strengthened with each email, each phone call, each comment. She wasn't just advocating for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had been silenced, humiliated, or ignored. Yet even as she prepared for the legal battle, she couldn't foresee the moment when justice would take a surprising turn. The weeks after Camille's arrest were filled with intense emotions and constant effort. Her law practice was initially reluctant, concerned that her public case might overshadow their carefully built reputation. But Camille stood firm. She calmly yet forcefully explained that the struggle wasn't solely about her. It was about establishing a standard. The viral footage had accomplished more than just spreading her story. It had ignited discussions throughout the city and beyond. The video of Camille, composed yet resistant as the officers forcibly removed her, became an icon of strength against injustice. Media outlets started calling for interviews, but Camille declined them all. She wasn't seeking publicity. Her attention was completely focused on constructing a case that would not only hold the officers responsible, but also reveal the institutional problems that enabled such conduct to continue. At night, however, when silence fell, the burden of the situation settled in. She relived the arrest in her thoughts, the condescending tone, the restraints, the whispers from the crowd. She considered how easily things might have gotten worse. The thought nauseated her, but it also strengthened her resolve. One evening, while she sorted through her research, Marissa dropped by with dinner. Camille barely glanced up from her computer as Marissa set the food down. "You've been working at this for hours," Marissa said softly. "I don't have an alternative," Camille responded without pausing. Marissa took a seat across from her, examining her expression. "You realize this is more than just a legal fight, right? People are counting on you now." Camille shut her laptop, finally looking at her friend. "I understand," she said, her voice firm. "That's exactly why I can't fail." Her preparation was thorough. She studied similar cases, finding precedents, and collecting evidence to challenge the officers' statements. She recruited trusted colleagues, assembling a legal team that shared her commitment to justice, but extended beyond the courtroom. Camille also made efforts to connect with the community. She participated in town meetings, heard from others who had faced similar injustices, and even addressed a local university about the importance of responsibility. One afternoon, while heading to her car after a meeting, a stranger came up to her. "Ms. Johnson?" the woman asked hesitantly. "Yes." "I just wanted to express my gratitude," the woman said, her voice breaking, "for confronting them, for standing up for all of us." Camille felt her throat constrict. She managed a small smile. "I'm simply doing what I'm able to do." The community's backing was both empowering and burdensome. It gave her strength, but it also increased the expectations. She couldn't disappoint them. Then one day, her lawyer called with updates. The officer she was pursuing had submitted a motion to dismiss her case. Camille had anticipated this move. It was a typical tactic to slow down the proceedings. But as her attorney outlined the next phases, she became motionless. "Camille," he said carefully, "there's something else you need to know. You've been assigned to preside over one of their cases next month." The irony was incredible. Camille leaned back in her chair, absorbing this development. She had spent weeks preparing to confront these officers in court. Now, destiny had given her a completely different form of justice. For a moment, she questioned whether she could handle it, whether she could sit in that position and stay neutral. But then she reflected on everything they had subjected her to, about the people counting on her to take a stand. This wasn't mere coincidence. It was a chance to demonstrate what genuine justice meant. The courtroom filled with quiet conversations as people entered and found their seats. The case wasn't particularly notable, an internal disciplinary hearing involving two officers accused of excessive force in a separate incident. To most observers, it was just another routine day in the justice system. The two officers, Carter and Daniels, sat at the defense table, wearing their uniforms like protective armor. They leaned toward each other, speaking quietly, their expressions indifferent, almost disinterested. To them, this was standard procedure. Another obstacle to overcome, another case to dismiss. Then, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and the room became silent. Camille stepped onto the bench, her black, judicial robe flowing behind her. She moved with determination, her expression calm yet authoritative. As she took her place, she looked toward the defendant's table. The response was instant. Officer Carter's face lost all color, his eyes growing wide with shock. Daniel shifted uneasily, his jaw clenching as he struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. It was her, the woman they had humiliated and arrested at the park. Camille allowed a brief moment of silence, letting the significance of the situation settle throughout the room. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she opened proceedings. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat rigidly, their confidence crumbling. Carter whispered something to their attorney, who nodded but kept his attention on Camille. For the first time in weeks, Camille felt she had the advantage, but she knew this wasn't about getting even. Her role as a judge required fairness, and she would maintain that principle. Still, the irony wasn't missed by her or anyone else present. As the lawyers delivered their opening statements, Camille maintained her professionalism, listening carefully and making notes. But occasionally, her eyes would shift toward the officers. She could observe the tension in their posture, the way their hands moved nervously. During a break, Carter and Daniel stepped into the corridor, their voices hushed but frustrated. "How is she the judge?" Carter whispered harshly, his irritation barely controlled. "This must be orchestrated," Daniels muttered, shaking his head. "It's not orchestrated," their lawyer interrupted. "It's coincidence, and you need to concentrate. She's not your adversary here. Your behavior is." But the officers weren't paying attention. They were too overwhelmed by the bizarre nature of their situation. When court reconvened, Camille remained professional, ensuring the hearing continued fairly and smoothly. Yet her mere presence seemed to disturb the defendants. Each time she spoke to them, they fidgeted in their chairs, their self-assurance deteriorating gradually. At one moment, during witness testimony, Camille noticed Carter stealing a glance at her. His expression wasn't defiant. It was something more like remorse, as if he was starting to grasp the seriousness of their actions. By day's end, the tension in the courtroom was unmistakable. Camille concluded the hearing, her gavel striking with authority. "We will resume tomorrow at 9 a.m., she declared. As the room cleared, Camille stayed at her bench, organizing her paperwork. She could sense the weight of the officers' stares as they hesitated by the exit, clearly debating whether to approach her. Ultimately, they didn't. They departed quietly, their footsteps heavy with the understanding that this was far from finished. But for Camille, the real test wasn't the irony of the moment. It was in the choices that would follow, and whether justice could truly succeed. The courtroom was crowded the following morning. Word of the unexpected development had circulated, attracting a larger audience than typical for a disciplinary hearing. Some attended out of curiosity, others to support Camille, though they understood her judicial role meant she couldn't show favoritism. Camille entered with the same calm, collected bearing, her robe flowing as she climbed to the bench. The attorneys immediately began their arguments. The prosecutor systematically presented evidence against the officers, offering testimony from a victim of the excessive force incident. "Your Honor," the prosecutor stated, "the officers' conduct was not merely poor judgment. It was deliberate abuse of authority. Their behavior demonstrates a pattern of disrespect for the very citizens they are sworn to serve." Camille nodded, absorbing every detail, her pen moving across her notepad. Her concentration was unwavering, even as the defendant squirmed under her observation. The defense lawyer stood to respond, his tone controlled but tense. "Your Honor, while we recognize the incident occurred, we contend that the situation intensified due to circumstances outside the officer's influence. Their purpose was not harmful, and we believe this case lacks adequate foundation for disciplinary action." As the argument proceeded, Camille couldn't overlook the similarities between this case and her own experience. The excuses, the rationalizations, it was all too recognizable. Yet she set aside her personal emotions, determined to let the evidence lead her. When witness cross-examinations began, the courtroom tension increased. The prosecutor called a victim to testify, a young man named Ethan. His voice shook as he described a night he was forced to the ground by the officers during a routine traffic stop. "They didn't even allow me to explain," Ethan said, his eyes nervously moving between the lawyers and the officers. "It seemed like they had decided I was guilty before I even spoke." The prosecutor continued, "Did you resist their commands at any time?" "No," Ethan replied firmly. "I was frightened, but I followed every instruction." It made no difference. They had already formed their opinion. The room fell silent as the defense attorney rose to cross-examine. He attempted to find weaknesses in Ethan's account, but the young man remained steadfast. Camille watched intently, her expression giving nothing away. Then came the moment everyone anticipated. The defendants were called to testify. Officer Carter was first to take the stand. He looked nervously at Camille as he took the oath, his voice unsteady as he responded to prosecutors' questions. "Officer Carter," the prosecutor began, "you're accused of using excessive force in this incident. Can you explain your actions that evening?" Carter paused, his gaze moving toward Daniels before responding. "I believe the situation was getting out of hand. I made a decision." "And do you think your actions were appropriate?" Carter shifted uncomfortably. "At that moment, yes, but in hindsight, I might have approached it differently." The prosecutor pressed forward. "Approached it differently, how?" "By not tackling an unarmed, cooperative person to the ground." Carter opened his mouth, but remained speechless. His silence was telling. When Daniel's turn came to testify, his demeanor was equally strained. His attempts to justify his behavior only strengthened the prosecutor's argument, emphasizing the officer's failure to accept responsibility. Camille listened carefully, her face revealing no emotion, but internally she felt both frustration and sympathy. These men had been entrusted with authority, yet they had used it carelessly, leaving harm in their path. As the day continued, it became evident that the evidence against the officers was compelling. The prosecutor's closing argument was forceful, calling on the court to establish a precedent that abuse of power would not be accepted. When the defense presented its final statement, it was obvious they were struggling. Their arguments lacked substance, and even the officers appeared to accept the probable result. Camille adjourned the hearing, her voice steady as she announced that a decision would be rendered the following week. As the courtroom emptied, Carter and Daniels remained near the door there, faces ashen and worn. For the first time, they seemed to understand the severity of their actions and the reality of what lay ahead. But justice wasn't only about consequences. It was about responsibility, transformation, and ensuring that past errors would not recur. A week later, the courtroom was quiet as Camille entered to announce her decision. Every seat was occupied, the tension almost physical. Reporters filled the rear wall, their pens ready to record every word. This was no longer simply a case about two officers. It had become a representation of a broader struggle for justice and accountability. Camille's voice was calm but strong as she began. The duty of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those given this responsibility abuse their authority, it undermines public confidence and causes damage far beyond the direct victim. This case has exposed the results of such conduct. She paused, her eyes surveying the room. Carter and Daniel sat at the defense table, their heads lowered. The impact of her words was clear. The evidence presented has shown that Officers Carter and Daniels used unnecessary force, ignoring procedures they promised to follow. Their actions were not only unjustified, but represent a disturbing pattern that must be confronted. Camille detailed the consequences: mandatory suspension without compensation, participation in comprehensive retraining programs, and a formal disciplinary record that would remain with them. The ruling was strict but equitable, balancing accountability with the possibility for improvement. When she concluded, Camille closed the case with a decisive strike of her gavel. This court is adjourned. The officers rose, their expressions grave as they prepared to depart. Before leaving, Carter hesitated and faced Camille. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely heard. "I apologize. It wasn't sufficient to repair the damage, but it was a beginning." Camille acknowledged his words with a nod, without offering forgiveness. Real change, she understood, would come through deeds, not words. As the court dispersed, Camille remained seated, taking time to reflect. She had witnessed justice served, but the victory felt mixed. For every case like this, numerous others remain unspoken and unresolved. Later that evening, Camille attended a community gathering at a local recreation center. The room was packed with people eager to tell their stories, express their frustrations, and share their hopes. As she listened, she felt a renewed sense of mission. One elderly woman approached her after the meeting, her voice shaking with emotion. "Thank you," she said, holding Camille's hand firmly. "What you accomplished in that courtroom means everything to us." Camille smiled gently. "This is only the start. We have much more work ahead." The following weeks brought meaningful discussions between community leaders, law enforcement, and local advocates. Camille used her position to push for reforms, stressing the need for transparency and accountability in policing. The case had created a chain reaction, not just in Fort Collins, but throughout the state. People started demanding change, advocating for policies that prioritize fairness and equality. For Camille, the journey wasn't about personal validation. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't have to experience what she had endured. The fight for justice was continuous, but moments like this reminded her that change, though gradual, was achievable. As she stood on the courthouse steps one afternoon, watching a group of young activists assemble for a peaceful demonstration, she felt optimistic. The system wasn't perfect, but with enough voices, it could be moved toward progress. And that, she thought, is the kind of justice worth fighting for. If you believe in the power of accountability and change, subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire action and reflection. Let's work together to make the world a fairer place.